almost killed her. Take care of our wife.
Why is dead Grandma alive in our living room?
Rick, why are you old?
The hole manifests your greatest fear.
I'm afraid of watching you die.
Seems like losing me made you cooler.
You died everywhere. I think my greatest fear is letting you go. I'm not leaving without you.
My God, I know what I'm afraid of.
Rick and Morty Season 7 was a wild, inconsistent ride that had some of the strongest episodes of the series, like the big showdown with Rick Prime or The Observers, while also giving us episodes I don't even know how to feel about. But I had a hunch that they would hit it out of the park with the season finale, and luckily, I was right on the money! Maybe I'm still riding the high that this episode gave me, but in my opinion, it's one of the best season finales the show has had. And a big reason behind that is simply because instead of focusing on deepest lore or setting up a new antagonist to theorize about, the show chose to bring the focus back on our two lead characters, something that was much needed in a season where it felt like they were barely together. A trip down the Denny's fear hole leads to the sudden return of Diane, and Morty uncovers his deepest fears. And although everything's not what it seems, as Morty finds himself in a race against time, determined to escape the hole before fear itself devours Rick, this episode still reveals quite a bit, from giving us a taste of the dynamic between Rick and his wife, to Morty's own feelings towards Diane, and it leaves us questioning the future of Rick and Morty as a duo heading into Season 8. So sit back and relax, as I unpack this absolute mind-blower of an episode.
I have observed it. Now gaze upon me, and so shall you.
Let's kick things off with a little recap, some TLDW for those who missed out on the episode, or just need a quick refresher, and so I can point out some details that don't fit into my overall analysis. Then we'll dive into the real meat of the episode. The episode just dives right into it, no cold open. Rick and Morty feel like they've seen it all. Nothing scares them anymore. And I mean, after watching yourself die a million deaths and witness horrors beyond human comprehension, that makes sense. Lucky for them, a mysterious man we'll just refer to as Mr. Fear points them to the scariest place in the universe, located on Earth, within a Denny's. Is it punching down or stealth product placement? You be the judge. The scariest place in the universe is actually something dubbed as the Fear Hole, found in the men's bathroom. Honestly, I was already on the edge of my seat when they mentioned a public restroom. You don't want to know what follows a grand slam. Mr. Fear pitches the hole as a win-win situation. It feeds off your fear like how sea creatures feed off your dead skin. It's harmless. So if you jump in and conquer those fears, you'll walk away a fearless person. Morty, eager to prove himself as always, dives right in, but quickly finds that the hole is too much to handle. Don't think too hard about that. But of course, Rick comes to his rescue, planting the seeds for this episode's real twist, as it's the first instance of Morty's dependency on Rick in the episode. After seemingly escaping the hole and returning back to the Smith family, everything seems fine and dandy until the status quo is disrupted by the arrival of a young Rick and Diane. My jaw literally dropped. I was hoping this episode would be Diane-oriented, but it still caught me by surprise. This Rick is from a universe where he managed to save Diane from Prime's bomb. Maybe he had just figured out portal travel before Prime dropped the bomb, but I guess the details don't matter all too much, as the end result is the same. This Rick leaving his wife in the hands of C-137, and leaving Diane shell-shocked as she finds herself decades in the future, surrounded by a family she never got to meet. But wait, how can portals transcend time itself? I mean, isn't time travel something Rick explicitly doesn't mess around with? Well, yeah. It's an immediate indicator that they're still in the hole, which Rick and Morty instantly pick up on. This prompts Rick to call out Morty's fear of abandonment, that if Rick gets Diane back, he won't need his grandson anymore. Of course, Rick is right on the money, but Morty denies his theory and drags out the episode for 18 more minutes, confronting some of his other insecurities like his fear of not being accepted. But hey, it gives Rick a chance to reconnect with his wife, which leads to some interesting revelations. Revelations that, in spite of this episode's twist, I believe are 100% authentic for a reason I'll elaborate on later. We learn that Rick has the ability to de-age himself, which explains how Prime retained his youthful glow. It's unknown if Rick is currently de-aging himself, although it would explain how he stays in great shape. But Morty seems to think that Rick will be de-aging himself well into Morty's adulthood. This also cements that Rick was 27 when he lost his Beth and Diane, spending at least his 30s and 40s hunting down Prime. It's kinda sad he lost true adulthood to the worst parts of himself. Side note, I caught Rick's suggestion that the family goes out for ice cream, when that was something he presumably indulged in with Diane regularly, something they were going to do before Prime derailed his life. It's such a heartbreaking yet adorable detail. Rick's been yearning for this. We learned that Diane was a bit of a brainiac herself, although it seems like she wasn't on Rick's level.
Your master's thesis, non-human intelligence.
When did you read that?
It makes sense that Rick would fall for someone that shared his love for science and could engage in heavy conversations, being pretty intelligent herself, but still contrasts his big ambitions by preferring a down-to-earth lifestyle, something he admires about her. It's apparent to Morty that the Whole is feeding off of Rick, who's becoming visibly ill, but is too smitten with Whole Diane to let go. And after an unsettling conversation with Mr. Fear, Morty decides if Rick won't leave the Whole, then he'll just put himself through the gauntlet so the Whole eats him up instead. Of course, Rick doesn't want to see his grandson kick the bucket, so he lets go of Diane and decides to help Morty conquer his fear. Once again, Morty is being dependent on his grandfather. Interesting. After a classic Rick and Morty rap, haven't had one of those in a while, they think they finally escaped the Hole, facing Morty's fear of public embarrassment and not being accepted, but they quickly discover that it just keeps going. And Morty sure is adamant that it's Rick keeping them in there. Eventually, they just decide to say screw it and be content with not even knowing if they're still in the hole or not. And at first, I thought they were going for a crazy new status quo where we were just left questioning if they're still in the hole. But instead, I was met with a crazy montage of Morty growing up, sporting the same look his 20-something self had in Rick and Morty Jack. Good visual consistency. But this montage just turns out to be one of the best bits this show's had in a minute, as it all leads up to the punchline of Morty becoming his father. Another fear of his. He's still in the hole! This all accumulates in the real twist. As Morty begins to lose hope of escaping the hole, Rick declares that they can't give up. They're Rick and Morty. Rick isn't leaving without him, because Morty's irreplaceable. And hearing these words causes it all to click with Morty. Rick isn't really in the hole. He never jumped in after him. We never saw Rick jump in. He just manifested in response to Morty's fear. This Rick, Whole Rick, was telling Morty what the problem was the entire time. But instead of accepting it, Morty fabricated an entire Rick and Morty adventure based off of his experience with and knowledge of Rick. Assuming that Rick wouldn't be strong enough to resist a replica of his wife. He hoped that Rick would jump in the hole after him, when in reality, Rick assessed the situation and realized that it wouldn't pan out in the first place.
You can't face two fears at the same time. If my fear was fire and yours was water...
I get it.
Morty realizes that his true fear really is being abandoned by Rick. Not only do I really like this twist, but it also serves as a great parallel to Season 1's M. Night Shyamalan's, an episode where Rick realizes he and Jerry were trapped in a string of simulations, and the Morty that was tagging along for the ride was just a facade, behaving how Rick assumed Morty would. I love when they're able to pull off callbacks like this. Absolute peak. After truly facing his fear, Morty is freed from the hole and warns Rick to stay away, informing him of the weird psychological torture he endured, but inadvertently enticing Rick by name-dropping Diane. Thankfully, Rick is able to resist temptation, and instead of diving into the hole, he embraces Morty's victory over it, pinning a photo of Morty on the wall, putting his own ego aside to champion his grandson, ending the season on a pretty sweet note, but painting a lot of fear for the future. Alright, so let's get into the nitty-gritty, starting with the fear hole. How the hell does this thing work? Well, in spite of it feeding off the fears of those who enter, the hole actually seems pretty therapeutic. It can be boiled down to a glorified sensory deprivation tank. You know, those pods full of water that you hop into and float around in, maybe have a hallucination and uncover some deep-seated issues. The finale of Atlanta actually centers around this concept and has a similar premise to this episode where, halfway through, you start to question if Darius is still in the tank. It's a wild ride. I highly recommend that entire show, but you get the idea. When we see how Morty really looks in the hole, he's just floating in some black water. like a tank. Everything from the moment he jumped into the hole was all in the mind. Rick even affirms it's basically meant to be a float tank by mentioning only one person can go in at a time. With that being said, whoever jumps into the fear hole seems to be knocked unconscious the moment they make contact with the water, as it suspends the subject's mind in a world rendered by their own memories and insecurities. What do I mean by that? Well, it's clear these recreations of Rick, Summer, Beth, Jerry, and Diane think they're real, and they behave pretty much how Morty expects them to. Morty's peers also seem to react to situations like normal people, at least as normal as you can get for Rick and Morty. Everyone's thoughts, emotions, actions, and fears are all genuine, even if the whole thing is a facade. Summer, Beth, and Jerry especially aren't trying to push Morty into any direction, they're just trying to live their lives out in the background. Well, aside from Beth, she's pretty involved with Diane's return at first, but that makes sense because that's her mom, bro! This logic is why Rick has enough self-awareness to realize he's in the hole, but not enough to acknowledge he's actually an extension of the hole. Morty's used to Rick picking up on illusions like this pretty quickly, but he doesn't recognize that he himself is an illusion because Morty was hoping that Rick jumped into the hole after him. This is also why whole Rick and Diane are shown conversing and moving the plot along even when Morty's not around, and why Rick is able to convince Diane that she's a part of the illusion. Everything he does is based off of how Morty perceives Rick. But Rick is also where Morty's insecurities seep into the illusion, as Rick's knack for meta-dialogue reveals exactly what Morty needs to overcome. His fear of getting replaced and abandoned by Rick, leaving him with nothing because of his over-reliance on Rick.
I'm afraid that if I jumped into a hole, you wouldn't even bother jumping in after me. You'd just stand there and watch.
It's a pretty dope contrast to Evil Morty, who wanted to so desperately break free from the Rick and Morty dynamic and simply desired to be left alone. It makes me wonder how Morty can overcome this fear, especially with the bittersweet revelation that Rick didn't jump into the hole after him. Although he seems fine with it, he's easily startled when Rick goes in for a hug because it caused him to spiral and question if the whole thing is real. Which is tough for Rick because he's someone who's actively changing and trying to become more vulnerable around his family. To me, this all paints a very specific picture. That as long as Morty is unsure of Rick's true intentions, the only way for Morty to truly conquer his fear of being dependent on Rick is to let Rick go, walking away from Rick before Rick can walk away from the family. And I'd even go as far as to say he projected this truth onto whole Rick as he struggled to let go of Diane, despite knowing that his continued attachment was literally killing him. Not only that, but the show has proven time and time again that letting go of Rick is the hardest thing for Morty to do, whereas Rick is able to move on pretty quickly, if he thinks that's what's best for Morty. The whole Crow fiasco being the biggest example of this on both sides. Morty went out of his way to age himself up in an attempt to manipulate Rick back into the family. Of course, the ending of this episode shows that Morty isn't disposable to Rick. He wouldn't have pinned up Morty's photo, or even have had the photo on him otherwise. Morty is one of the most important things in Rick's life. However, something else this ending also shows is that Rick is terrible at communicating that directly. Morty doesn't know that he's irreplaceable. He didn't see Rick hanging up the photo, and that lack of affirmation may be their downfall down the road. I could be reaching, I know. After all, I made a video holding on to the idea that Morty's eventually going to break free from Rick and sort of stumble into becoming the next Evil Morty. Check that out if you haven't, I promise it makes more sense. And call it copium, but all the pieces seem to be in place for this very thing to occur. I wouldn't be surprised if Season 8 actually shows Morty trying to act more independent and handle things without Rick's guidance, and just generally try not to worry about his standing with Rick, especially since this season already kept them apart for most of its run. Of course, there's a possibility that the fear hole truly did rid Morty of his fears, which would be huge, as we've known Morty as someone who's often paralyzed by fear and his own self-doubt. It's a huge part of his character, it's why bro literally stumbles on his words all the time. No longer being held back by fear may enable Morty to be more confident, which could still lead to problems down the road, as we know a confident Morty is quick to become a cocky Morty. And we know how Rick feels about Mortys with a big head.
A cocky Morty can lead to some big problems. Can be a real bad thing for everybody.
Oh yeah, how's that?
But let's switch gears to Rick and Diane. I love that we finally got to see Diane interact with Rick and the family in the present day. And I gotta say, I really like her character. As writer Heather Ann Campbell explains in the behind the scenes, Diane is someone who pokes fun at Rick's nihilism, taking it all in stride.
She's sharp-tongued with him. She finds this nihilistic, dark shit that he's doing funny. That would be the kind of woman that Rick would love.
In a sense, they share a similar outlook on life, but they have different takeaways. The best way to describe it is that meme of those two guys on the bus. One's happy, one's sad, but they're both saying, nothing matters. She challenges Rick's perspective by spinning it into a positive light. And that's what grounds him. If nothing matters, then they have the choice to define the things that do matter to them. It's that perspective that prompted Rick to choose quality time with his family over exploring the vast multiverse. Why he still chooses to prioritize his family to this very day. Rick clearly lost his way after Diane's death, but I choose to believe that he still finds little pieces of her within Beth, Summer, Morty, and sometimes Jerry, which is interesting because Dan Harmon once described her as unremarkable and like a female Jerry, but I'm glad he decided to fold and let the writers give her a bit more nuance than that. Every meal they share, every movie they watch together, every adventure they embark on, they all encapsulate Diane's values, and they're what keeps Rick going in a world that's begging him to give up. It's why Rick didn't jump into the fear hole at the end, why he's content with never seeing Diane again. He doesn't need to delude himself or go to the ends of the earth to reverse what Prime has done. He's able to accept things for what they are and simply cherish Diane's memory. Because even if he can't see her like this, he still gets to see her every day through his family. And okay, I know what you're thinking. That's a very sweet sentiment, but this Diane was fake, bro. How could any of that track if she wasn't the real deal? Or at least an extension of Rick's memories, since that Rick was fake too. Well, despite Rick never jumping into the hole in the first place, I'd argue the characterization we got for Diane in this episode is still genuine. I'd even argue the show gave us an in-universe explanation as to why this is legit a little while back in the season 5 finale. Morty's seen Rick's memories through the brain scanner, and although Rick Mirai Jack focused on Rick's tragic backstory, Morty, just like Evil Morty, was presumably exposed to everything. So it's likely that whole Diane's persona is informed by both Morty's perception of his late grandmother and Rick's own memories of her that reside in Morty's subconscious. Meaning that this is an authentic look at the person Diane was prior to her untimely death. Unless the day comes where Rick can reverse the Omega device, or we just simply get more flashbacks, this will be the closest we get to meeting Diane Sanchez. I just don't think the writers would talk so passionately about Diane's portrayal if it ultimately didn't hold any weight. I do hope we revisit Diane and her impact on Rick in the next season, but for now, I'm pretty happy with what we got to learn in this episode. She's been an enigma for so long. With all of this said, I do wonder if the show plans on introducing a real version of Diane down the road to really put Rick and Morty's relationship to the test. While a part of me feels like that would actually undermine this episode, there's another part of me that obviously wants to see this happen solely to examine Morty's reaction more than anyone else's. I mean, yes, Beth and Rick getting the chance to engage with Diane after everything that's happened would be great. But now I wonder if Morty would make a genuine attempt at connecting with his grandmother, or if he would reject her presence and develop resentment towards her rather quickly. Hey, maybe we'll find out next season finale. Oh yeah, there's also the post-credits scene. In spite of his promise to improve as a person and accept things for the way they are, Mr. Poopy Butthole hits a new low after stealing a portal gun off screen, hopping dimensions and doing the old switcheroo with a random counterpart. But he seems to have only made matters worse for himself, as Amy immediately picks up on the fact that this isn't her husband, and thus, a new chapter in the Poopy Butthole saga begins. They're kinda dragging it at this point. I wonder if the PB dumped in the Parmesan universe is actually going to factor in the next season, or if they'll just leave this gag on the back burner until the next season finale's post-credits. Knowing this show, it could really go either way. But as always, these are just my thoughts, and I want to hear yours. What were your thoughts on this season finale and season 7 as a whole? Let me know in the comments down below, and keep the conversation going by giving me a follow over on Twitter and Insta at AwestruckVox. If you enjoyed this video, please sort a like and subscribe to the Roundtable for more great cartoon content. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have an awesome day. Peace!